Welcome everyone to our ISM New Jersey webinar series. I want to do a special welcome to all of our ISM members from different parts of the United States who are able to join us today, and also all of our guests as well. Be sure to use the Q&A button or the chat function for any questions you may have for our speaker today. And we do encourage you to ask questions. Please ask questions. Now on to our feature presentation for today. Our speaker today is Dr. Michael Urick. He's the Graduate Director of the Master of Science Management Operational Excellence Program and Associate Professor of Management and Operational Excellence at the Alex G. McKenna School of Business, Economics, and Government at St. Vincent College. Dr. Urick has a PhD and an MBA. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses related to organizational behavior, human resources, communication and conflict, organizational culture, operations, and research methods. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Leadership and Management and the North American associate editor of the Measuring Business Excellence Journal. He is also the editor of the Exploring Effective Leadership Practices through Popular Culture book series from Emerald Publishing. Huge welcome to Dr. Urick, and I now turn the stage over to you for the presentation.
Well, great, and thanks, Kathy, for having me. It's great to be a part of ISM. Just a little bit of background that Kathy actually didn't share is that I've been involved with ISM probably for about 15 years or so. I've spoken at 3 of the national conferences, and I actually was I'm a past president of ISM Pittsburgh, which is the closest chapter to where St. Vincent is. And I'm actually scheduled to present at this upcoming year's conference in Florida for ISM too. So I've been involved with ISM for quite some time, but I've never had the opportunity or the pleasure to present for ISM New Jersey yet. So I really appreciate Kathy and ISM New Jersey having me. It's really an honor. Thank you very much. Today we're going to be talking about leading a culture of excellence. So let's just dive right in. Here's what I'm thinking about for our agenda. And as Kathy mentioned, please do ask questions in the chat. We'll be doing a Q&A session at the end of my comments. But I want to first define what I mean whenever I talk about leadership and excellence. What are those two terms, and how can we understand them? But I also want to define what we mean by organizational culture, because when you think of things like leadership and excellence and culture, they're words that we're all familiar with, but actually to define those terms can be quite challenging. We all know in our mind what they mean, but they're quite fuzzy concepts perhaps. And so I want to make sure we define all of them. Before moving on to discuss the importance of culture, why is it so important to spend 45 minutes or an hour on an afternoon to talk about culture, and to talk about the elements of culture, and then of course talk a little bit about the focus of today's session, which is what is a culture of excellence perhaps, and how as a leader can we help transition to that. So let's define. Leadership is a process of influencing followers. There are so many different definitions of leadership. That's one of my personal favorites. It's a process. It's influence. So influence is about, getting others to do something that benefits perhaps a greater good, a common good. Gets them to work together. Influencing them to do things perhaps they might not otherwise have done. Operational excellence is a management philosophy. So leadership and management, not exactly the same, but you kind of get some overlap between those two concepts. Operational excellence is really a mentality, a philosophy, and it's focused on continuous improvement, waste reduction, and problem solving. When we think about both of these things, both related to organizational culture, because to be an effective leader, you need to understand your context, your culture. You're not going to be able to lead if you don't know your context well. And I'll share an example of that in a couple of minutes. You also need to understand your current environment to move toward excellence as well. overcoming the stigma of operational excellence. Whenever I say OE, that's, as Kathy mentioned, that's the program that I direct here at St. Vincent, is our graduate program in management operational excellence. But it's very closely related to lean. However, we take more of a cultural approach to facilitating improvement and waste reduction and problem solving. Why I say you need to understand your current environment is this. I do a lot of talks about OE and a lot of consulting about excellence, and I'll hear this from many organizations, and that is, well, Mike, I tried this stuff and it doesn't work. These tools just don't work. Well, and my thought is the tools actually do work, but you have to make them yours in your organization. You can't just throw tools. You can't just throw some of these terms that might be difficult to remember, a Kanban or an andon or 5S or, whatever tool or term you want to throw out to your organization. You can't just throw it out and expect it's going to stick. The culture has to support it. The assumptions, the values of that culture need to support those artifacts. And we'll talk more about what I mean by those terms in a couple of minutes as well. To really move then to that type of an environment, to an OE environment, you have to understand culture. You have to understand context. So if we're going to further define an organizational culture, there are 3 levels: assumptions, values, and artifacts. So in an organizational culture, in those 3 levels, we're talking about the key values, the beliefs, the attitudes that are shared, that are understood and shared. In a strong culture, we say that everybody understands what these values are and everybody accepts them and goes along with them. In a strong culture, that actually has a strong influence on behavior. So I have 2 pictures here represented, one of Disney and one of Google. And I would suggest that those organizations represent very strong cultures. People that would work for those organizations are probably able to articulate the values of those organizations. And, it's such a strong culture that as you're a part of it, you really adopt those values. They become part of who you are. And if you don't adopt those values, you probably leave or are exited from the organization, hence creating even a stronger culture. And so those individuals that are there go along with the values, the assumptions, and what the artifacts of the culture are telling them to do. And so you see that strong influence on behavior. Why is it important, though? So one, I already mentioned that it's a strong influence on behavior. And so that's probably enough to suggest why culture is important. But even more so than that, it's an informal system of control. That sounds kind of manipulative, and I'm not suggesting that it is or isn't. But what I am suggesting is that a culture helps us to understand the norms. It helps us to understand the social order and what things are appropriate within a certain context. As a system of shared understanding, it helps us to determine the way things are done in this group, the way things are done around here. And so the culture can represent a set of forces that normalize appropriate behavior. If we have a strong culture, it can help us stabilize our organization for predictability. If we can predict how everybody in this group is going to act, what their behaviors are going to be, we can predict what the organization itself, how the organization itself will perform. Now, again, we'll talk a little bit later that's internally. There's a lot of external factors as well that have input to our performance overall. But internally, we can predict how people within our organization will perform. But it also has an influence on organizational processes, because those processes that we carry out are part of our artifacts. And so let's break down those elements of culture. I already mentioned them once: assumptions, values, and artifacts. I like to think of cultures very much like an iceberg, very much like an iceberg. We see the artifacts, okay? And as I'm talking about these levels of culture, think about how these relate to perhaps the culture that you work in. And by the way, I did not come up with this stuff on my own. This is by a famous cultural researcher by the name of Edgar Schein. One of my most favorite books, Leadership and Culture, written by Edgar Schein, Schein. I highly recommend that book if you're interested in learning more about leadership and culture. But to paraphrase what Schein says, these are the 3 levels. The artifacts are things we can see. we experience with the senses. They're physical manifestations of the culture. And as you walk around your facility, this is the layout of your facility. This is perhaps even the pictures on the wall whenever you come into work in the morning. This is maybe even, the layout of your lunch space, your break room. This is perhaps even the layout of your parking lot, who parks where. These are any things that you experience with the five senses. What you see, what you hear talked about, the stories that you heard being told. Well, in an iceberg, that's the tip that's above the water. You don't see the values and the assumptions underneath it. But the values and the assumptions drive those artifacts. So artifacts are physical manifestations or physical representations of the values and the assumptions. What are the values? Those are the things that we care about. Those are the things that are important to us as a group. We think about our assumptions. Assumptions are deeply held values that become so ingrained that we don't talk about them anymore. And so these are things that we perhaps don't even realize we think about. They're a mindset that we have. So to share with you a little bit about my organization that I work in, I think maybe thinking about an organization and these three levels might be a little bit helpful. I work in a Benedictine liberal arts college, and our assumptions actually are documented. Many organizations do not have their assumptions documented, but ours are clearly documented in the Rule of St. Benedict. And so those are our assumptions, but they kind of fit the mindset of many people in the organization. Now, beyond that, the values, the importance of tradition, the respect for community, the respect for being open and welcome, those are all values that we talk about, that we care about, that are driven directly from that Rule of St. Benedict. Now, the artifacts themselves then are manifestations of how our classrooms are set up. Okay, if we care about community, our classrooms are going to be set up in small type of facilities in which people can see each other, in which we can have a dialogue, in which we can interact. Our cafeteria here on campus is called the community center, for example. We have a hub around campus where you're seeing gathering spaces. These are all things that represent in the values. Those are artifacts, things that we see with our senses. The architecture here has respect for tradition. And so these are artifacts that really are derived from the values, and the values themselves are derived from the assumptions. So that's my organization that I work for. I would encourage you as we go through this session today to think about those three levels of your culture. What are those things you don't talk about that you just assume that everybody understands, your worldview, that then drive those aspects that you really care about, that then drive the artifacts, the things that you can see. And I saw that Eileen actually put that in the chat there, the Organizational Culture and Leadership book by Edgar Schein. Thank you for sharing that. And also, I saw that someone asked if I could share this presentation. Yeah, I believe that Kathy is recording it, and I would also be happy to share the slides as well. So that's no problem at all. So thanks, Eileen, and thanks, Marisol, for those questions. Here's the thing. Two things I want to mention about culture. Again, one, where we're talking about changing culture to fit more of an excellence mindset. Those comments that I get where people say, I gave my people all the tools. We tried to implement 5S in my organization. We tried to do all this stuff. Well, actually, you just tried to change the artifacts. You didn't change the values, what people really care about. You didn't change the assumptions, the worldview that people in the organization have. And so, of course, they're not going to stick. Because if you think about it, what made the Titanic sink? The Titanic's floating along, sees this tip of the iceberg there, and thinks, yeah, I can just float along and push this iceberg out of the way. But in reality, there's a lot of depth there. I'm going to float along and I'm going to get wrecked by the values and the assumptions. And so many organizational change consultants would suggest the same thing. If you just want to change those artifacts, like how your processes are run or the tools that you use to do your work, they're not going to be adopted unless they're frozen above the values, which are frozen above the assumptions. We have to change all three of those areas for that new mentality, for those new artifacts to take effect. But let's just think about that. Let's think about how difficult it could be to change our behavior. I mentioned the analogy of a culture being like an iceberg. I also think a culture can be like a fishbowl, because with a fishbowl, you get used to swimming around. I don't know about you, but whenever I was a kid, I used to like going to carnivals and amusement parks. I remember one particular game, which is you have a ping pong ball and you bounce the ping pong into a fishbowl. And if it lands in the fishbowl, then you get to take home a fish with you. Maybe some of you have played that game as well. Whenever I think about culture, I put myself in the mindset of the fish. Okay. I'm in this clear plastic bag. I am now going into this new home, this new fish tank, this new fishbowl. But you know what? I've swam in a fishbowl all my life. Excuse me. So I think I know what swimming in a fishbowl will be like because I've done it all my life. But now I'm put in this new fishbowl. Splash. Wait a second. Holy crap. This water is colder than I thought it was going to be. This water is warmer than I thought it was going to be. Or this castle looks different. Or these rocks have a different texture to them. It's different. Because even though I've been in a fishbowl before, not every fishbowl is the same. Not every culture is the same. Okay. And to prove this, many of you might have worked in a variety of different organizations and similar roles. And so you might say to yourself, okay, yeah, I've been a purchaser in this organization before. So whenever I go into this new organization, this new job in a similar role, it's going to be the same. It's going to be a little bit different because the culture is a little bit different. And you get that. You kind of get that, when you're new to a culture, you get that feeling when you walk into the room that I don't know 100% of what's going on here because I'm not acclimated to the culture yet. Now, what happens over the time, though, is in strong cultures, you're the fish swimming in the water day after day, month after month, year after year, and you start to forget you're actually swimming in the water, right? Because you become acclimated to the water. The temperature you just adjust to. It's like whenever I jump into a pool or you jump into a pool. Wow, that water is cold whenever you first get in there. But after 15 minutes, it becomes second nature. It becomes part of who you are. The culture that you're swimming in becomes part of who you are. So much that we don't think about how it influences our behaviors. So much that we don't think about those underlying assumptions. So that when we have to change, when we have to move to a culture of excellence, we're so much in that mindset of the fishbowl that we can't get out of what we're currently doing sometimes. We have to break that mold. We have to break out of that. Well, that said, let's talk a little bit about if we want to move to a culture of excellence, what that looks like. What are those three levels in a culture of excellence? So we understand what a culture is. We understand it's difficult to move out of a strong culture. We understand it's difficult to change. We understand those three levels. Now let's take a kind of a break here and talk about if we did move to a culture of excellence, what would it look like? Again, the caveat here is that every culture is a little bit different, but perhaps there are some commonalities of cultures of excellence that we could share, that are shared. The artifacts of culture of excellence. One being that vocabulary. Some people find it challenging when they look at a lot of terms that they don't understand or words that are perhaps foreign to them. Kanban, andon. I don't know what these things are. It's a challenging vocabulary. And so those are the culture of those are some artifacts of that type of a culture. But also, if you think about the tools, various problem solving tools, the 5 whys, fishbone diagrams, waste elimination and process improvement events, Kaizen events, standardization, having standard worksheets, having standard work document in some way. These are all artifacts of cultures of excellence. And I apologize. I just came from an hour and a half long meeting where I had to do a lot of talking there. So my voice is a little bit dry right now. So I apologize for that. But those are some artifacts of many cultures of excellence. Here's the funny thing, though. And here's where I say that the different cultures are different and should be different, even though these might be common across cultures of excellence. The specific tools that you use or what you call them can be unique to your organization, or how you adapt them to your organization should fit the values, should fit the mindset. It's not a one size fits all approach. It's like I tell my students in the graduate program, You don't have to do exactly what Toyota does to be lean. You need to make lean work. The concepts are good, no matter what organization you're in. Continuous improvement, waste reduction, problem solving. It leads to more sustainability. It leads to less variability. Um, it leads to perhaps better quality and customer satisfaction. But we are not all Toyota, so we can't adopt those tools in the same way. We have to make them work for us. But if we have those ideas, those goals in mind, we can do that, and we can call these things whatever we want, and we can adopt whatever tools we want to, so long as they fit our values and assumptions. So, what are some values that tend to be similar across cultures of excellence? One is providing quality to customers. And by customers, I'm not even just saying necessarily the people that we're selling to, but the people that work with you, the people that are, impacted by your part of a process. Those are our customers, internal. As challenging as this is, a true value of cultures of excellence coming from the idea of respect for people would be no layoffs, even in challenging times. We don't want to get rid of people. Flexible stability is an important value. With flexible stability, we want to reduce variation, so we want standardization. But as soon as we find a better way, that standard can change. So employees, as they're working on their process, they're working on their jobs, as they see something that can be improved and changed, that standard can change. And that standard should be written and documented by the employees themselves and then improved upon. Of course, common to many lean organizations, 5S or 6S, whatever you want to call it: sort, strengthen, straighten, scrub, standardize, safety, and then sustain. Waste minimization is a big value. And I have listed there a variety of different ways that you may already or likely are already familiar with. And of course, visual management. Representing metrics pictorially. The idea of Genshi Genbatsu, go to the source. Go to the source to see where the problems are. These are values that actually drive these artifacts. These values are things that we care about. And on top of those values are then frozen specific tools that help emphasize certain values over others. So if we're thinking about it, if safety is a value of our organization, part of 6S, we want to standardize work so that we're operating our equipment in such a way that no one's going to get hurt. It makes sense. It makes sense how these things relate to each other. Now, beyond that, assumptions drive the values drive the artifacts, but the assumptions drive the values. The deepest part, the biggest part perhaps of that iceberg. It's been argued that some assumptions of cultures of excellence would include respect for people. That then drives the value of safety, drives the value of no layoffs, drives the value of quality for our customers, which then drive the need for standardization tools. But also continuous improvement, the need to do something better, the need to be better today than we were tomorrow. These are interrelated, by the way. Why do we have that need? Well, perhaps because we care for people, perhaps because we want to give our employees a better experience, because we want to give our customers a better experience, perhaps. So these two assumptions are, of course, interrelated, but they drive the values and they drive the artifacts. We're going to transition here a little bit now. We know what a culture is. Within 5 minutes, we talked a little bit about it. It's a lot more complex than that, of course. But we talked a little bit about what a culture of excellence is. Now let's bring the leadership side into this. How do I lead a culture of excellence? How do I influence a culture? And I want to start off by sharing a little bit about a hero of mine. I'm not sure if anyone knows who's pictured there, but that's actually Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller was a very successful, famous big band musician from the 30s, 40s. And he's often pictured with one of two things, or sometimes both, usually a cigarette. He was an avid smoker and a trombone. But you know what? He actually was not really great at trombone. He was a big time smoker, but not really great at trombone, even though he's always pictured with it. In his context, in the big band era in which he was successful, he had a lot of competition, a lot of really good musicians. Tommy Dorsey, for example, was a phenomenal trombone player. trombonist, and one of Glenn Miller's biggest competitors. When Glenn Miller first tried to form his initial band, he tried to be like Tommy Dorsey or some of the other big band players that were really proficient in their instruments, so that he gave himself a lot of solos. They're very jazzy in nature, and he failed miserably. Why? That was not Glenn Miller's strength. What Glenn Miller was good at was organizing people, getting people to work together. Now, there's a lot about Glenn Miller that he perhaps was not the ideal musician. He, some people believe that he could have been kind of a little bit of a jerk. But one thing that he was able to do was standardize his music, have clear music for people to read, so that people could be, if someone left the organization or if a newcomer came, they were able to fit in and join and perform well playing that music, regardless of what instrument they played. He also de-emphasized the solos, knowing that he was not the great soloist himself. He then instead emphasized playing together, harmonies, and created really a unique harmonious sound. And by the way, if you're not familiar with Glenn Miller, I would advocate maybe YouTubing Glenn Miller after the session today, and you'll see some of and hear some of his most famous songs. In fact, songs I'm sure you're familiar with, you just didn't know it was Glenn Miller. And also, in fact, is that Glenn Miller was so successful, he disappeared over the English Channel one Christmas during World War II while trying to entertain troops. He was on his way, I believe, to France, and he was going to entertain troops in France, and actually his plane disappeared. Well, his band went on without him a few days later. His band actually is still touring now. Of course, no original members left, but the name of his band is still touring to this day. Glenn Miller won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Grammys, I believe, in the late 80s or early 90s. In other words, his impact has lived on. And to me, that's a sign of a good leader, right? If your organization is able to function well without you, even after you're no longer there, that organization can continue on without you. That's a sign of a good leader. But he failed miserably in his first attempt. He didn't understand his context. He didn't understand his own personal strengths. He didn't understand the context of his band. He also didn't understand the context of the world around him at the time. The world around him was in a lot of chaos and crisis, World War II, a lot of conflict. And so with his new band, rather than emphasize individual players and contributors, he created harmonies. Harmonies that were unique to his sound. Harmonies that brought his band together and seemingly brought the U.S. together. Interestingly, at the height of his fame, he joined what became the U.S. Air Force, that was then part of the Army. But at the height of his fame, he did this again, knowing his context, understanding where he could lead, and he led then the Army Air Force Band at that time. So we think about those external things. We think about our own strengths, weaknesses, as we think about context, how they fit into our culture. But we also think about what our followers can do. So there are two follower behaviors we want to think about, or two follower attributes: willingness and ability. Willingness is the degree to which our followers perhaps have motivation and drive to do certain things. Ability is, do they have the knowledge, skills, and ability, the expertise, to actually accomplish specific things, specific behaviors. And those individuals that we're trying to lead, perhaps within a culture, might vary on these two attributes, on these two behaviors. So that we have perhaps four types of follower readiness. Follower readiness being about willingness and ability. If we're high in both areas, we're firing on all cylinders. We're ready to go. If we have high ability, but we're not altogether willing, we're starting to work well together as a group, but we have somewhere to go. We have some improvement to make. We have some ability, low willingness, tasks are tough. If we have low ability, but high willingness, we're eager, but we're inexperienced. We want to learn as a group. And so what a leader needs to do in that context, as they're trying to influence our organization to be, to move more towards a culture of excellence, we need to understand our follower readiness so that we adjust how we act. We adjust our behavior to then either influence those followers, or train those individuals, or perhaps provide direction that are clear. So the optimal combination of leader initiating structure and consideration depends on the readiness of the employees. Before we talk about what initiating structure and consideration are, I want you to think about your own organizations. Do you see any of those behaviors within yourself, within your colleagues, within your direct reports, within your supervisors? How might they influence you to be an effective leader? And by the way, it doesn't matter what your role is. If we go back to our original definition of leader, it's anybody that can influence somebody else. It's a process of influence. So it doesn't matter what your title is. You can be a leader if you're influential to others in your organization. How might, though, others or your own willingness and ability impact your organization's capability to adopt an OE culture? And again, these are just things to think about as we're talking about this stuff. In the webinar kind of format, I know we're not going to have a dialogue about this. Sometimes whenever I do some coaching or talking to some organizations, this has some pretty good discussion, but I want you to think about those things. Now, I mentioned that willingness and ability is going to be related then to a leader's optimal combination of initiating structure and consideration. What does that mean? Well, those are two dimensions of leader behavior. And leaders can be low in both areas, low in one area, high in the other, high in both areas, somewhere in the middle of both areas. But initiating structure, and this, by the way, is coming from the Hersey and Blanchard model. Initiating structure is the extent that a leader defines and structures the roles of employees. This person is very production oriented. This person is very task oriented. This person is all about process. On the other hand, consideration is about the people side, trying to create mutual trust, trying to build respect, trying to create a good positive culture for the organizations. This person's focuses on recognizing their followers, focuses on communicating well. From these two dimensions, we can come up with 5 different leader behavior profiles and perhaps activities that those types of leaders would be most likely to engage in. A leader that is high in initiating structure and low in consideration is telling. That person provides specific instructions, supervises performance, maybe looks over their employees' shoulders. Selling is a behavior that someone with high initiating structure and high consideration would engage in. Here we're supporting, we're encouraging. Participating is when you would have low initiating structure, but high consideration. You share your ideas, you try to help the group conduct its affairs. Delegating, low initiating structure, low consideration, that's turning responsibility over, key behaviors over to employees. And somewhere in the middle is a medium level of initiating structure and a mid-level of consideration. You're providing a moderate level of support and interpersonal care. Now, you might be saying to yourself, yeah, I can see myself fitting in one of these 5 categories. And certainly, I think each one of us would have a preference for one of these 5. You also might reflect on a supervisor that you have or have had in the past. You might be saying to yourself, what would I want? And you might say, wow, high initiating structure, high consideration. This seems like a very good functioning team. I would like that. This person cares about productivity, but this person also cares about the people side, cares about me as a person. I like that a lot. You might say that telling sounds terrible. This person is very top down, doesn't really care about who I am, but is only focused on what I do. Well, you know, the actuality of it is that these things work in varying contexts. I once had somebody, a supervisor, not my current supervisor. My current supervisor is great, but a previous supervisor who was low on initiating structure but high on consideration. Wow, we had a great time at work. It seemed like a party most of the time. We didn't get enough stuff done. Guess what? An organization is no longer there. Okay, it sounds great, but it didn't work in that context. And so what I'm suggesting is that we have to find the fit. And this slide, for some reason, didn't copy the bell curve here. But if we think about it, this kind of fits a bell curve where R4 would best be delegating, R3 would best be participating, R2 would best be selling, and R1 would best be telling. So what does that mean? R4 means our team's already firing on all syllables or on cylinders. Means they're willing and they're able. In other words, this team knows what they're doing. They're really good at it. They want to work hard for the organization. As a leader, I got to get out of their way. And so this is where low consideration, low initiating structure could actually be a good thing. I want to get out of their way and let my team do their stuff so that I can focus on other things. Maybe I can focus now on being a spokesperson for the organization or for my department or being a figurehead. Because my team, that group of people that's following me, they already know what they're doing. On the other hand, R1, we know low ability, low willingness. Yeah, we probably don't want this type of a leader or a manager, this person that's telling exactly what needs to be done, but it could work in that environment. And so what we want to ask ourselves, and the detail of this model, I think, is not as important as the takeaway. The takeaway to me is this: as a leader, you have to understand your context. You have to understand your people, so that although I know that I have a preference for one of these 5 leadership types, one of these leader behavior types, I know that I need to flex that. I might need to change that to fit my environment, to fit my context, and to fit my people. Leadership is a process of influence. So now we know who our people are. We know our own preference. We understand a little bit of our culture. How do I try and influence that then to move towards a culture of excellence? There are 5 bases of power that can help us become more influential. This is from French and Raven's classic studies of leadership, I believe, late 40s, early 50s. So this has been around for a while, but to me, very apparent, very easy to see how people can become more influential in organizations. I always love to talk about this stuff because I think that immediately as I talk with people about this, light bulbs come on. They can think, oh, I see why that person is influential. I see why that person is a leader in my organization. The first 3 are based on where someone's at in an organization, or more the formal side of leadership: legitimate, reward, and coercive power. Legitimate power means that person has a position of formal authority. That person has the job title of CEO or of director or of manager or whatever. And as a result of where that person's placed on the org chart, as a result of that person's title, yeah, certainly that person's influential because they have people that report to them that have to listen to what they're saying. Likely that person also has reward or coercive power. Reward power basically means you can give others what they want. You can give others a raise. You can provide somebody with a promotion. Coercive is the other side of this. Coercive is kind of the more punishment side, or perhaps withholding good things side. So on the coercive side, if you have an employee that's not performing well, you have the ability to terminate that employee. That's coercion, and that is a base of power. And so that you want that person to engage in certain behaviors because you have that power to punish that person if they don't. It influences that person on what to do. Now, those are based in the organization. The bottom 2 that I've listed there, expert and referent power, those are more based on personal, a person's sort of individual characteristics. Expert power is simply what that leader knows, what they're good at. And so if you think about why that person might be influential or how they can grow influence from that base, because as an organization, you want to keep that person around, right? So they're influential because they can get kind of what they want, because the organization wants to take care of them, wants to keep them around, because if they leave, we might not be able to function as well tomorrow as we can today with them here. So we want to make sure we keep them around. As a result, they're going to influence how we treat that person, how we treat that leader. They're also influential because these people can be the teachers, the mentors in our organization. If they have some unique knowledge, skills, and abilities, we need them to pass those on to others. And by the way, as they're passing on those KSAs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, they're probably also passing on their mindset, their way of thinking, some of their values. And so they're influential with that regard to the up and comers of our organization. And lastly, referent power is kind of just like that likability factor, that emotional factor. I'm sure you've been involved with or in the same room with people that just have a glow about them, right? They seem like they're a magnet. You're at a party and it's where people all want to be around that person. That's referent power. there's a likability factor here. And as a result of people having that strong positive emotional connection, they're influential as well. Now, the more influential you want to be in an organization would suggest that you have more than one base of power. And I would also suggest that the bottom two are perhaps more powerful than the top three after a certain level. Right? The first three are based on where you're at in the organization, but anybody can have the bottom two. But if you have all five or four or multiple ones of these, that's where you're going to be able to be more effective leader from the standpoint of influencing others. So let's say that you as a leader embrace excellence. You understand your context, where you are right now. You understand what a culture of excellence looks like, so where you need to be, how you need to change those assumptions, the values that then lead to the artifacts of a culture. It's still not just about you, though. Everybody has to embrace excellence. And this is where it comes from, not just changing those artifacts, but influencing the change of those assumptions, influencing those change of the mindset, the values, and the way people think. Everybody needs to get on board for a true culture of excellence. And the leader is not just the only person, but a leader can help influence others to go in the right direction there. Well, kind of sounds simple. And I know in about 45 minutes, I shared all you need to know about being a leader in a culture of excellence. But it's a lot more complex than that. And part of the reason why it's more complex is that we're talking just right now about internal issues. But let's not forget our external environment. We have societal trends, we have technology, we have the economy, we have the legal climate, we have demands for our customers and our suppliers. We have our competitors that are engaging in different tactics. We have other stakeholders that are impacted by our decisions. So we have a lot of other things that strategically as an organization or as a leader, you may need to think about as you attempt to influence, as you attempt to move yourself to a more culture of excellence. So as a leader, you're going to need to balance those behaviors that fit internally to your organization, of course, with the opportunities and threats that are external to your organization. That was a lot in a short period of time, and we covered a lot of ground, but basically, in essence, what I did was, this is almost a semester or 2 semester long course in our graduate program that I condensed down to 45 minutes. There's a lot of depth, I think, to each of those topics, but I think I gave you a flavor a little bit about my perspective on how to move organizations to a culture of excellence. At that point now, then I think I'm going to stop and see what questions you have. And Kathy, if you want to help facilitate, I'll be looking at the chat as well, but I'd be happy if you wanted to help facilitate too.
Okay, no problem. Audience, please just put your question in the chat or the Q&A function. And that way Mike can answer your question on this. There was definitely a lot of information. Do you have like additional resources or books that you suggest that maybe our audience could look at?
Yeah, I think the Shine book that I recommended already is a great one. But I think there are certainly various books on leadership as well. You know, the Hersey and Blanchard method is out there as well in books, but I can send you some links as well, Kathy, if that would be helpful. And then you can take a look at some of those, but certainly I think the best starting place would be the Shine book. That's, you know, what I oftentimes offer to organizations and to my classes in terms of leading a culture. I'm also actually, you know, I've written several books myself on the topic of leadership. And there's one that's coming out in 2022 at some point, talking about effective leadership, but more from a multi-generational standpoint. And that's actually what I'll be talking about primarily at the ISM conference in May this year. And that is, how do you lead an age-diverse workforce? And so that's something that I would also recommend. I'm in the process of writing that right now.
Okay, we have a couple of comments coming in. One that came in, is it not difficult to change culture, move towards OE from the bottom up, if upper management is telling?
Yes. Well, I think, Michael, I think what you're asking is, if I'm understanding correctly, let's say that you're in an organization and you have a supervisor that is sort of taking that telling mentality, but you want to make a change. You want to have some influence there, but yet it's a very top-down type of an organization. It's a top-down type of a culture. Very difficult. And this is where I say you have to understand the culture and the context that you're in. Are there ways that your voice can be heard? Are there ways that you can leverage to get management to perhaps, I don't know, stop that telling approach? It's challenging, and there's not really any specific advice I would have for you. But as your question suggests, is it not difficult to change the culture? Absolutely. It is always difficult to change a culture. And so, a cultural shift does not happen overnight. If you're going to change a culture, it's much more likely it's going to be gradual or evolve. And so to do that in a planned way can be quite difficult. Yet we know that many organizations do want to move to an OE culture. The best thing I can tell you is that small wins are one way to do that. So if you have that telling supervisor and you have a new way to do something, and so let's say that you want to change the culture to more of an OE mindset, and you think, okay, I want to embrace this particular tool. Using that tool and getting small wins, getting some results that then piques the interest of your supervisor, and then hopefully that person will be open for a dialogue with you to say, how'd you do that? And then you can say, I use this method and I use this, and starting to change that person's mindset then can go a long way. So those three levels have to go along at the same time. But it's, I think in that instance, only by making that telling supervisor see what can be done, the changes that can be made, can help implement the change in the mindset overall, the assumptions. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, we have a few more questions that came in.
Sorry.
Do you have advice for leaders looking to influence and support their teams during times of major organizational change and uncertainty?
The thing that I can best suggest is this. I actually did some research on this related to multi-generational workforces in COVID. There's a lot of obviously uncertainty right now and a lot of organizational change right now, as we all know. Is to offer some type of assurance and comfort. This is, I think, where that consideration side of being a leader, being a manager is really important. I'm not saying we want to let that initiating structure side go. We have to also be focused on process and our employees doing the job, yes. But I would say many organizations right now where we're lacking, especially as organizations perhaps are more virtual and you don't get to see people face to face as much, is where we need to really focus on the consideration side. Reach out, give some assurance that things are going to be okay, even if you're not sure yourself. And in many instances, being honest with that. Look, I don't know where we're going, but I'm going to do my best to get us out of this situation or to make this the best scenario that we can possibly make it. I think having that realistic approach and having that type of open nature and that type of consideration can go a long way.
Okay, how is the leadership dynamic affected by virtual hybrid environment, and what adjustments are necessary for this?
From what I've seen and from what I've read and researched is, if we're thinking about leadership in the sense of culture, I've seen leaders that are really good in understanding their culture and being able to lead within that context. Now, as we're thinking virtual hybrid, those cultures which used to be strong might not be as strong anymore because we don't have those artifacts as signifiers of what the values or the assumptions are of the organization. The artifacts kind of hold us together. They're derived from the assumptions and the values, but they hold us together and they hold us in place. And without those common experiences, it becomes much more difficult to lead a team or influence a group of people as people are kind of becoming more isolated and doing their own thing. And so what I would suggest for that type of a leader is to find ways in which you can still create a strong culture. I have a couple of students of mine, grad students of mine, who've worked online pre-COVID, but also have shared with me in class discussions, we work for strong cultures. And I asked them, well, how do you do that? And they said, whenever I log into my laptop every morning, the company logo is right there with the values. We have status meeting checks throughout the day. I feel involved. I feel engaged. We have happy hours in the evening. One Friday we'll do, as silly as it sounds, we'll do funny hat day or something like that. Anything that can give a shared experience. So you're still building that culture in some way, and that it's purposeful in the sense that the way you're building culture is in some way reflective of those assumptions and the values. You have to find a way to keep that culture intact.
Thank you. Okay, I have found it more difficult to influence long-term employees. Is there a preferred influence method you would recommend?
The interesting thing, and the other side of the leadership definition that I didn't mention, is that leadership is about influencing others while resisting unwanted influence in return. Okay. And those long-term employees, what type of power do they have? Well, they probably have a lot of expert power, right? They have a lot of knowledge about what they're doing and the process in your organization and the people in your organization. So they have the expert knowledge. They also have the referent power, the referent power. Why? Because probably a lot of the employees like them. They look up to them. They're their heroes. And whenever I say that what types of power are stronger, and I said those two are it for me, even if those individuals don't have titles of authority, because they have the referent and the expert power, they're going to be influential. Now, that other side of the leadership definition that I didn't share earlier is that you want to resist that unwanted influence in return. So those long-term employees may want to try and influence the organization. And sometimes they want to do so in a way that's counter to what you want. Okay. What you need to do is to find that commonality. What do I want? What does the long-term employee want? Okay, that is counter to what I want, or that seems to be counter to what I want. If you can find that commonality and bring that person then on board, that person is going to be on your side and use their influence then to help you out. So case in point, my graduate program went online back in 2014. And in my institution, we are really one of the first online programs. But we saw the need to do it. Yet there was still some longer term, I would say, people within the program that were a little bit hesitant. And they didn't see the need for it. And so what I did, I would sit down. I said, I really need your support. We need your support to be successful. And we had frank discussions about how this fit what we were currently doing. Ways it was similar, ways it was dissimilar. I talked about how it would support them. A lot of it was fear that they were worried about moving to an online model. But when we talked about it, and we said that this actually fits our culture. I mentioned before where I work is about a culture of welcomeness and hospitality. Well, if now instead of just people physically in our classroom, we can broaden this to a larger group, that's welcoming others. That's part of who we are in our culture. And so I made that resistor perhaps a part of that. And I linked it to the culture with which they were already familiar with. And I also made sure that their referent, their expert power was acknowledged and appreciated and still leveraged. And so they felt valued in that new approach.
Thank you so much. We did have one other comment from one other attendee. Wanted to give an FYI on French and Raven's 5 forms of power.
Awesome, thank you.
They put the link in there as well.
Appreciate that.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you very much. We're actually out of time now.
Okay.
But I want to thank you, Mike, for coming to our group and presenting this particular program. I think it was very informative, and I know a lot of people have taken away a lot of information from this presentation. And at this time, I'm going to be closing out the program, but I just wanted to do a little note to everybody that you will get a copy of the recording. We will send a copy of the slides as well. So as soon as I get the slides from Mike, I'll include that with the email that I'll be sending out afterwards with your continuing educational credit for attending today as well. Next week, we will have a program on November 10th, and it's going to be the next frontier in risk management for supply chains guarding intellectual property. It's going to be with Dr. Stephen Carnival. So I hope everybody can attend that particular program as well. At this point, I'd like to say thank you for joining us today, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thank you, everybody.
Kathy, could I just put in the chat too my contact information in case if anyone wants to reach out to me? Yeah, I actually should have done that on the final slide. That's my email address. And then you can search for me on LinkedIn as well. I'd be happy to connect with everybody. But there's my email address in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'll make sure everybody gets a copy, the email, your email address as well, your contact information, when I send out the information later on today.
Great. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thanks everybody for joining us and have a great day, everybody.